Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning. Hopefully, you're all sitting comfortably and you have cups of coffee ready for you, and a few bickies to keep you going throughout the interesting stories that we have today to be presented by Jodie. So, yes, we are. I'm Andy Watts. I'm from Example IT. I'm a reseller. We are here to talk about Copilot this morning. I'm just doing a round of intros and to give you some directions on what's going to be happening this morning. We're going to be taking questions throughout the event, but those questions may have to be answered offline. Jodie will be doing a few select questions at the end of the session, depending on how much time we actually have. We will be doing a very light introduction into Copilot and the securities that are required around it, the governance, the compliance, and also a little bit about how to deploy it into your environment. So, all that being said, I'm going to hand over to Jodie, who appears to have vanished off our screen.
Some would argue that that is the best thing, but hopefully you should all be able to see a slide in front of you just with the agenda for today. But yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Jodie Haughton. I lead Insentra's Global Adoption and Change Management and Copilot practices. And most recently, I was seconded to Microsoft for 18 months, where I was helping their strategic partners develop their Copilot practices. So, as Andy said, we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We are going to start with a brief overview of what is Copilot for Microsoft 365. We're going to have a little look at some of the architecture and the foundational security that Microsoft has built into the tool. And then we're going to start talking about what you need to do to prepare your Microsoft and your Microsoft tenant and your data in order to be ready for Copilot for Microsoft 365. Now, we also want to talk about what you need to do to prepare your people. We're going to spend a decent amount of time on this because a lot of people tend to see Copilot as a purely technical change, and it's really, really not. And we'll come on to the reasons for that later. We're going to have a little talk about governance and policies at the strategic and also the technical level, and then finish off with next steps and then time for questions. So as Andy said, if you can pop your questions in the Q&A panel, we do have another few team members sitting on in the background, looking at the Q&A, looking at the chat. So any questions can go in there for starters. Okay, so cracking on. First, what is Copilot for Microsoft 365, or sometimes referred to as Microsoft 365 Copilot? The branding has been a little bit interchangeable over the last few months as Microsoft has kind of settled on what they want to actually call it. So Copilot for Microsoft 365 uses the new generation of AI functionality that is basically trained on vast amounts of documentation. It uses something called a large language model to really understand not only the words that we use when we're communicating, but also the intention and the nuance behind language in a much more human way. And this enables it to generate much more original content that almost sounds like a person could have written it. And it also enables us as users to interact with the AI assistant using natural language. And it's going to understand it much better than previous generations of artificial intelligence could have done. Now, the difference with Microsoft's Copilot offerings is they take this generative AI capability and they embed it into the Microsoft 365 functionality that we know. So, as you can see on the slide here, first off, you've got this single chat destination that you can basically go to and prompt the AI for answers to specific questions you have, whether it's something to do with your work data or when you switch it to the web, it can go and search online. Now, personally, I've found this to be incredibly useful when I'm looking at research, when I'm looking for statistics to back up some of the things that I want to say. By using Copilot to do this and by prompting Copilot well, I can shave an hour off a research task quite easily. So that initial chat destination is a really, really good way just to kind of dip your toe in and start to understand some of the capability of Copilot. Then you've got your Microsoft 365 apps. So these are the apps that so many of us use on a day-to-day basis when we're doing our work. With Teams, you've got AI-generated meeting notes, and Copilot can pull actions out from those meeting notes, and you can ask questions about priorities in the meeting. What was the main intention? The decisions that were made, were they easy to come to? Because Copilot can interpret the nuance, it can interpret the tone, and it can interpret the sentiment in that meeting. When you're looking at Outlook, you can start using Copilot to draft, redraft, summarize emails for you. With Word, you can start off content, because we know nothing is worse than a blank page sometimes, and helping you to rewrite in different tones, different type of language, change the length, change the audience. With Excel, there's massive new functionality that's come out in the last month to really help analyze and extrapolate data and enable people to use Python modeling, even if you're not a Python coder yourself. You can create presentations in PowerPoint based on other source material in your tenant, and Copilot can start that off for you. And this functionality across all of these applications is developing so quickly. Now, the third panel on here is that it's connected to the Microsoft Graph. Now, the Microsoft Graph, for those of you who haven't come across that terminology, is effectively the underlying network of data and interactions that Microsoft collects whenever we are using one of the M365 tools. It means that if I was to go into Teams and ask Copilot about my most recent meetings with Susan from finance, because it's got access to the graph, it's got access to our organisational data, it'll be able to know who Susan from finance is and pull out the relevant information. And the last panel on here is Copilot Studio. This is all about extending Copilots and customizing them for your specific business processes. Now, this is a huge topic in itself, so I am going to leave that one to one side for today. But if anyone is interested in having a conversation about customizing and extending Copilots, that is absolutely something that we can do. So the core benefits of this, really, organisations are mainly finding it in the personal productivity space at the moment. A personal example with the Teams meeting notes and actions. With my last role, I was meeting with a lot of partners and having some quite similar conversations with them, but they were all a little bit different. And same but different is some of the worst to keep track of. And I was probably saving around 2 hours a week by basically outsourcing meeting notes and drafting of actions to Copilot. It made that element of my job so much easier and actually enabled me to focus much more on the things that I could do to really help those Microsoft partners raise their game. Having that capability to remove some of the drudgery from work, then we need to look at, okay, this extra time that we're getting back, how do we siphon that and funnel that into more creative, more innovative endeavours, or give people time for upskilling and development? But there's real work to do there in an organisation in terms of not only looking at the productivity gains, looking at how it can impact your KPIs within your departments, but then looking at how we can take that freed up time and put it to the best use. So we did mention the Microsoft Graph in the last slide. One of the big concerns around Copilot adoption is security. And because it does have access to the graph, it's got access to an awful lot of your organisational data. Now, Microsoft has built in an awful lot of tooling to keep your organizational data safe and secure. So when you have licensed users who are logging in with their Entra ID and using Copilot, your data is protected by your Microsoft Commercial Data Protection Agreement. So this is the same agreement that covers all of the data that Microsoft may be storing for your organization anyway. As long as your users are logged in with an Entra ID, that organizational data is protected. So on this diagram, there is a kind of sideways L-shaped dotted line. That designates the Microsoft 365 security boundary. And you can see that when the user prompt comes in on the top left, all of this moving between the Microsoft graph and the large language model all happens within that data boundary. So anything that is going in as a prompt, anything that is being stored in your tenant, any organizational data you have got is not being used to train external large language models. And that's a really, really important point, because we'll come on to one of the kind of dangers of shadow IT later when we start to talk about governance. And all of the usual security functionality and resources still apply. So things like logical isolation of your content away from the content of other organizations. Everything that Microsoft normally does to protect your data will still apply. Now, it's really important to understand as well that Microsoft Copilot works with the current permissions on your tenant. So if you have a person who has access to a load of documentation on a specific project site and a person who doesn't, then they are going to get very, very different answers from Copilot if they ask about that project. Because for one person, you're going to have access to all of the information about that project. For someone else, they might just get, yeah, this is a project that exists. If they don't have access to anything about the project at all, then Copilot won't even come up with anything for them. So it's going to work with the permissions you have on your tenant, and it's only going to surface what your users would have access to within this data boundary. There are a couple of boxes that fall outside of the major kind of L shape in the middle, and that's mainly to do with plugins and external sources. Obviously, Microsoft cannot hold themselves responsible for the security posture of any third parties that might be providing plugins. So if you're going to add extra bits to your Copilot environment, then you've got the responsibility there to check that you're not going to be putting yourself in a bit of a security loophole. Bing is mentioned outside there as well. There is a setting within Copilot that enables users to not only look at organizational data within your company, but also enables Copilot to go out to the web. Now, it's really important to note that when that happens, the specific prompt that a user puts in is not the prompt that is sent out to the wider internet. Basically, your Copilot within your L-shaped data boundary is going to take that prompt and it's going to modify it. And it's only going to go out to the internet to ask it for things that are relevant to go out to the internet for. So it's not going to ask for something that specifically lives inside your customer tenant from outside of it. So that prompt modification is another thing that is in place basically to keep your internal data secure and ring-fenced away from the rest of the world. But it's really important to note that all of these security kind of posture that Microsoft has put in place, this is only one part of the puzzle, because there are massive, massive things that we need to do to get your tenant ready for Copilot in the first instance. So at its most basic, we need to remember that Copilot is an add-on for your licensing. So you've got to have a prerequisite Office Business, Office Enterprise or Microsoft 365 Enterprise or Business license in place first. There's a massive list of prerequisite licenses. So what you need to do is just make sure that you have got your prerequisite licensing in place, and remember that Copilot for M365 is an add-on. It's also worth remembering that different tenant security features are available at different levels of licensing too. So you may be looking at things like SharePoint Advanced Management, or looking at some of the more advanced capabilities of Purview. So it's really important when looking at your specific tenant to understand the security measures that you need to take, and make sure that you've got the right levels of licensing and capability according to that. Now, we've already mentioned that the data that people have access to is based on their user permissions. You do not want people being able to access other people's accounts. So if you have not done this already, please, please, please secure your accounts with multi-factor authentication. It is a really basic security measure that everybody really should have in place. If you haven't done it, now's the time to do it. You also want to consider doing a full ROT analysis. So you want to be looking for redundant, outdated, and trivial data on your M365 tenant. For this purpose, we can almost think of Copilot like a database. Think garbage in, garbage out. If all of the data that Copilot has access to is frankly rubbish, then the responses that it's going to give to your prompts are not going to be what you need. Also, when you've got this massive, massive sprawl of data, all you're doing is increasing the surface area for potential data breaches and potential issues with permissions. So really getting your tenant tidied up and getting that old, irrelevant, outdated data out and somewhere else is a really, really good idea. We need to start thinking about retention policies here. We need to start thinking about archiving. We need to start thinking about all of those best practice data control and governance measures that you can apply within your M365 tenant. Permissions. We've already said that Copilot works with what your users have access to. So you want to make sure that your permissions and your sharing settings are set up as they need to be. And you really need to have a look for sensitive and confidential information. So personal identifying information is a really good example. I've seen examples recently of clients where people have got massive amounts of like national insurance numbers hiding away in someone's OneDrive. And it's like, no, this is a really good opportunity to stop behaviour like that, because we want to get to an environment where we know what sensitive and confidential data we have, where it's stored, and we want everyone within an organisation to understand their data protection and their security responsibilities. So when we're looking at data governance on the tenant, we've got a nice slide of actions here. This looks quite nice and approachable with its 8 little tick boxes. What I would say is there is an awful lot of work to do behind each one of these steps. Something like checking default sharing settings. That's all around, when someone shares something from SharePoint or shares something from OneDrive, what is the standard thing that pops up when they click that share button? Now, making changes to that from a tech perspective is actually quite simple, but we do need to think about from a user perspective, if we start changing those default settings now, is that going to interrupt business process? What kind of user education and comms do we need to send out to make sure people understand that change? Can we start using this as an opportunity to segue into some wider training around people's responsibility around data governance? So even something as simple as that, when we start to dig below the surface, there's quite a lot of work to be done, both on the technical side, but also on the business and the upskilling side. There will be some organisations who have set sharing as a default to only people in your organisation to try and stop external sharing. If that is you, then I would absolutely recommend looking at that and having a chat with someone about it before you implement Copilot, because again, that is a setting that now someone with that link within your organization can open that file, whatever it is. You may not want them to have access to that, and easier access to it through Copilot. Copilot's not going to create any data risks for you that don't exist already, but it will make the ones that already exist easier for users to surface. So things like setting policies for your inactive sites. Again, there's a level of consultation here that you're going to want to go to with the wider business to understand, A, how have we got into the situation where we've got X hundred SharePoint sites that are just sitting here doing nothing, and getting to a point where we've got governance and controls going forward. For sensitive sites that hold particularly confidential data, you're going to want to go a level deeper. Have we got the right controls in place here? And do site owners really understand their responsibilities in terms of looking after this data? There's a huge amount of auditing and control that we can exert through Purview. So let's have a look at your Purview usage. Are you using this to the extent that you need as an organisation to protect your data? And let's not forget all of this around sensitivity labels, DLP policies, retention policies, and communications compliance. It's all going to be different based on your organisation. There's going to be a set of best practices that you can get off the internet and someone will say, we should do all of these things. But you really need to think about it in terms of the level of confidentiality of the data that you look after, your users and how they're going to respond to any changes, and things like the sector that you're in, and whether you've got any additional external regulatory requirements that you have to meet. All of that brought together is what's going to give you your unique approach to each of these 8 tick boxes here. And it's well worth spending the time and the effort to do that now, because all of this will become foundational for the whole of your M365 tenant governance going forward. And it's going to be massively foundational to not only the security of Copilot, but also the results that your end users can get from it. Now, this is a lot, and I fully appreciate that a lot of organisations are going to be in a position where they go, we're just not ready to do this. When Copilot first rolled out with the early access program customers that we were working with within Microsoft, I felt like there was a feeling in Microsoft that people's tenants were more mature from a data governance perspective than actually they were in practice. So in order to combat this and in order to help customers who are not quite there yet, Microsoft have now rolled out the restricted SharePoint search, try saying that quickly, capability for Copilot, which means you can restrict Copilot to only look at a certain subsection of your SharePoint sites. Now, on one hand, that's great from a security perspective, but we also need to consider that if we are actively limiting the amount of information that we are giving the large language model access to, then we are massively limiting the quality of the responses that users will get back from Copilot. And convincing users that Copilot is a good thing can be very challenging. So anything that makes their Copilot experience not as good as it could be really does need to be taken quite seriously in terms of decision making, because we don't want to be in a position where we're trying to roll out a product that sort of half does the job for users, and then a few months later when we've got tenant governance sorted, we go, hey, it's really good now, because by that point the users will have just switched off and gone, nah, tried it, didn't like it. So think very, very carefully before restricting the access that Copilot has quite heavily. Other interim measures, a lot of the early access customers whose tenants weren't ready ended up using non-disclosure agreements for their Copilot users. And that, combined with a really clear and robust reporting process for data breaches, combined together, tended to do the job for most of these customers and got them to a point where they were comfortable with the risk exposure from exposing too much data internally. So that's another thing to consider, maybe looking with your service management team to go, look, can we build in an additional reporting process that escalates something through the service desk if someone has access to information that they shouldn't have when they use Copilot? So, just take a drink. On the subject of people, I've already mentioned that a lot of the time people tend to see Copilot as a very technical project. In terms of tenant readiness and security, absolutely. But Copilot is not like a lot of technologies whereby you roll it out and your users have to use it. Think about an operating system upgrade. You go through all of the technical processes, you test it on a pilot group of users, you roll it out, and everyone gets some training documentation and they have to use it. Copilot is not like that. You can give a user a Copilot license and they can completely opt out of using it if they choose to do so. And that has been the biggest sticking point that we have seen throughout both the Microsoft Early Access program and also our own experience as a Microsoft partner. People will do the technical side of it, but they will not get the wider organization involved at the time they need to. And people will be given Copilot, they won't know what to do with it, they won't use it, and all of a sudden you're not getting the return on investment for that $30 a month license charge. So if we want that $30 a month to earn its keep, we need to start bringing people along on this Copilot journey right from the very beginning. So when we talk about this, I am going to assume that organizations will start rolling Copilot out with a pilot phase to prove the return on investment. Now, when we're talking about change management, one of the models that we can bring into play is ProSize ADKAR model. So that is what's up on the slide here. ADKAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And this denotes the 5 stages that we have got to take every individual user through to get them to the point of changing any habit. So in this instance, we're looking specifically in terms of Copilot. So awareness of the change. Do your colleagues and users understand why your organization is considering using generative AI? Now, this can be at the strategic level, this can be at the operational level, but it's really important from day one that as an organization, you have that strategic understanding of where you want to go and why you're doing it. From there, we start looking at desire to participate and support the change. This is really where we need to get into the nitty-gritty of different people's job roles and start answering the question, what's in it for me? If you can't articulate what's in it for me for a specific user group, then we need to dig into what's important for them, have a look at their job role, and start really understanding how the technical functionality of Copilot can impact them on a day-to-day basis. And then knowledge, how to change. This is kind of the theoretical, okay, so this is Copilot, this is what it does. Then ability, so putting that knowledge into practice and helping colleagues to use Copilot on a day-to-day basis in their role. And then reinforcement, because we all know from beginning of the year diet and exercise programs or getting a new diary and deciding to use it every day, starting to do something for a couple of days is fine, but then it's really easy for that to peter off. So we need to make sure that we are reinforcing that change on a consistent basis and setting people up for long-term habit change. So when we're looking at Copilot, early on in the process, we want to start involving as much of the wider business as possible in order to start looking at the use cases for Copilot and where we could get the best return on investment for those licenses. The best example I have seen of this is an organisation that basically ran internal workshops or kind of process style hackathons in order to identify use cases. So this was before they'd even given the pilot licenses out. They got people from all over the business together, taught them about Copilot, said why they wanted to use it, and let people go off and work out their own use cases, and then brought them back in, judged them, and the winning teams were the ones who got the pilot licenses. Now, that's brilliant for raising awareness because, you know, this was a massive, massive activity that covered the whole organisation. You had to be living under a rock to miss it. Desire. People were able to work out how to use the tool best for themselves, get really behind their own use cases, and then there was an element of competition in there. And let's be honest, with a lot of organisations and a lot of people, that helps too. And it was really helping with the knowledge and the ability side as well, because we're teaching people about Copilot and getting them to think about how they would use it before they're even using it. So that's an amazing way of starting to work through some of those ADCAR potential blockers in a technically focused change management activity. It's really, really important to think about sponsorship as well. So the key indicator of whether a change is going to be successful is whether or not you have an engaged, effective sponsor that is keeping up appearances throughout the entire project lifecycle. Now, they don't have to do all of the work themselves. We fully recommend that we start building up a sponsor coalition, so a little team of people to act on behalf of the sponsor. And that can often include people like line managers and preferred senders, because research shows that when it comes to your organisational messaging, your comms team is best. But when it comes to how does this change affect me on an individual basis, then line management is actually the preferred sender for that to help those messages land. And we also need to be really, really clear about messaging. If you are leveraging those preferred senders, you've got to make sure that everybody in that group understands exactly why we're saying what we're saying and how we want to say it. Because it's very easy when you have a team of people commsing for someone just to get the wrong idea and go a little bit off-piste with the messaging. And we need to make sure that we guard against that. So there's a lot of potential for building change management activities into what you do here. I would absolutely recommend doing this in parallel with project management and making sure reporting cadences match up. Project management and change management are two sides of the same coin effectively. So if you can get those linked up, then you will be putting a really good combined front on the project for the rest of the organisation. And you really need to think about what is going to make this project successful for your organisation, because you need that yardstick still to measure, has the pilot been a success? It's amazing how many organisations start giving out Copilot licenses without actually thinking about what their definition of success is and what they're trying to achieve. And then when they're called before the board to go, okay, how has this been successful? They don't know what to say because they just don't have that yardstick to judge from. So don't fall into that trap. And then when we're talking about training, we need to make sure that we are, again, drilling home the knowledge and the ability. What functionality is available in the apps? How do you even prompt Copilot? People who have line management experience tend to be much better initial Copilot users because they are used to explaining how they want something doing to someone less junior. Copilot is really good at interpreting your instructions, but they have to be good instructions. So there's actually some soft skills that we might want to work on here for users who haven't necessarily line managed people before. We also saw in the early access program, you would get organizations who got their first set of licenses, and they would want to look at as many use cases as is humanly possible with these licenses and get the biggest pool of data. So they'd give one license to someone over here, a couple of licenses to someone in another team, one license over here in finance, another license here in HR, and they would spread their licenses throughout the organization. This didn't work. Realistically, in order to help people change habits, so we're on the reinforcement point here, you've got to set up an environment where it makes habit change easier. If you've got a team of 10 people who are all used to working in one way, and you only give one of those people a Copilot license, and you're asking that one person to work in a different way to the 9 other people on their team, that's not going to stick. If you give Copilot licenses to all 10 and make sure that their manager is involved in, setting aside some time in a couple of their huddles to go, cool, what have we done in Copilot this week? Have we worked out a way maybe to streamline this process using AI? Then you'll stand a much better chance, A, of getting the best out of your use cases, but B, also reinforcing that behavior. And let's never, ever underestimate the power of a champions community or a centre of excellence within your organisation. Having external people coming in and doing the training is really, really valuable for getting that initial level of understanding to where you need it to be. However, having someone external enabling a champions community is actually going one step further and helping your organisation really level themselves up in future and helping you reach more people. Because if you hear something about this cool new tool from a peer, it's going to be much more relevant than hearing it from an external consultant coming in. So I would absolutely recommend you to leverage external assistance to do things like set up your champions, so then your champions can reach further into the organisation. So we did mention governance and policies. So it's really, really important to set out at this stage your organisational level policies for AI usage. When we talk about Copilot, that does bring its own security in natively, but there are issues like, I can't remember the exact stat off my head, but it was something like 46% of organisations definitely know that they have had someone from their organisation putting confidential data into a non-enterprise AI tool. Now, the difficulty with that is it means that that data can then be used by that tool to train their large language model and might actually get spat out in response to someone else's question using the same tool. Like I said, with licensed Copilot for Microsoft 365, you do not have that risk because all of your data remains within your enterprise data boundary. But if you have people using non-enterprise, non-internally governed AI tooling, then you run that risk. So from this organisational level, you've got to look at responsible AI usage. So what does responsible mean for your organisation? Are there certain scenarios where you don't want people to use AI at all? Now, we've got to remember these large language models are trained on huge amounts of data, but history books are always written by the winners. There is the risk of there being some unintentional bias in the data that has been used to train a large language model. So before you start applying AI to something like a hiring process, I would absolutely recommend that you run a huge number of tests first to make sure that you are not unintentionally bringing bias into the process. Shadow IT. Do we know which AI tools people are sharing enterprise data with? How are we going to actually educate users on the risks of sticking organizational data into this random AI tool that they found on the internet? How do we want to have these conversations with our users who might be desperate to use AI in their job, but we actually just need to get them to hold on for security's sake just until we're ready to give them something licensed? Those are conversations that you need to start having right now, because like I say, the stats are out there. It proves it is happening in organizations now. And in order to get ahead of that game and stop kind of adding to that statistic, the sooner you can have that conversation with your users, the better. Now, we can audit Copilot interactions as well. So when you've got your licenses up and running, you might want to be looking at Purview eDiscovery Premium. Have a look at the Copilot interactions that are happening in your tenant. And if someone asks Copilot for something they really shouldn't have, you can get in and you can delete that interaction and the response that Copilot gave. Now, that is quite a heavy-handed approach, and we don't want to turn into Big Brother looking at everybody's Copilot interactions, because that's just going to erode trust. So we need to have a serious conversation about when that course of action is actually warranted and reasonable within your organisation. And we need to think about data governance and retention. So earlier on in this process, you will have gone through a whole raft of improvements to get your M365 tenant up to scratch. Don't throw that out the window by then not implementing ongoing data governance activities and by not keeping up with the user education side of this as well. You can start from that beautiful clean slate, but if you don't have the processes then in place to kind of back that up, it's amazing how quickly we can go back to a effectively ungoverned mess of data and sprawl of sites that have just been set up because anybody can create a team. I'm pretty sure that's a very similar story for a lot of people, and anything that we can do in that longer term process to stop that being a problem, the better. So yeah, don't let that initial work go to waste. So we've covered a lot of ground. Biggest question, next steps. What do we do from here? You really need to start looking at your Copilot strategy, what you want to do with generative AI, and what does it mean to you as an organization. Then we need to start looking at use cases. On the ground, how can this be used in such a way that it will contribute to that higher level business outcome that we're aiming for? Let's get on with the technical readiness. And then when you're ready, get your selected users and go off, do a pilot, prove your return on investment, prove that it's going to be a success. And you can absolutely come and have a chat to me, have a chat to one of our other consultants. You can do that with no charge for an hour. Got a QR code. So you can scan that and that will take you to a link to sign up for a power hour. On the link, I think it does say have a power hour with one of our consultants, Edmund Davis. If you've watched the videos that the Example IT team sent out, then Edmund was the lovely gentleman from Insentra on those videos. But realistically, there's a team of us here. You might end up talking to Edmund, you might end up talking to me. Just tell us what you want on that form and you will be matched up with the consultant with the best skill set to meet you at your specific point where you are on your Copilot journey. So, thank you very much. And I think it is time for questions. Andy, are there any specific questions from the Q&A that are standing out to you?
Just one question here that is standing out is, does Copilot need to be assigned to all users inside the tenant?
No, it does not. Obviously, if you want someone to be able to use it, they're going to need a license. But you don't have to license everybody. And we absolutely recommend that in the first instance, you start off with a smaller pilot, depending on the size of your organisation and depending on the investment that you're willing to make upfront. Larger organisations have tended to go with a minimum pilot of about 50, but smaller organisations, we can reduce that pilot number and really tailor it based on standout use cases. So if it turns out you've got a team of 3 people here and a team of 4 people here that you both think could really, really make use of it, then we can validate that and we can start off a pilot with a much, much smaller number as well. It depends on where the best use cases are popping up, your initial appetite for investment, and also what state your tenant and your data's in. I have seen some organisations that are choosing to pilot with teams like HR first because they are less concerned about HR seeing what they shouldn't be able to see, because HR can kind of see a lot of stuff about us. So they've taken that risk element into their consideration when they're looking at their pilot users as well.
Just another one that's dropped in. If you have a license and search outside of the organization, the web search capability, does that stay inside your tenant? I'm assuming the data stay inside the tenant.
Yeah.
The search.
Yeah. As long as you are logged in with your Entra ID, yes. If you are not logged in to anything in your web browser and you just go onto Copilot and you start typing in a load of confidential data, then that is a very, very different story. That is exactly the kind of thing that we need to use user education to help people understand. Don't do that. Just don't. If you are logged in to your browser using your Entra ID and you go to Copilot, then you will see that there's a little green icon in the corner that basically says you're protected. Then 100% you can switch between work and web, and all of your internal data will be protected.
Cool. And last little one, I think, is does an external prompt update the LLM, the large language model?
Okay, so Copilot is constantly learning. When you license your tenant, if your tenant hasn't already been what we call indexed, then that process will start happening. And that's basically your instance of Copilot going through, building this index of all of your data and all of the links between it. When you pop a prompt into Copilot, that is going to be something that Copilot can then learn from. But bearing in mind, if you do this with your enterprise version and you're logged in, then it's only going to make your version of Copilot better. This is how Copilot can start learning things like internal lingo and acronyms and things like that, that's going to make its responses much, much more specific to your organization and what you do. So yes, the large language models do learn. An external LLM that is not connected to your organization is not going to learn from your organization's data unless you purposefully feed it to that when you're not logged in.
Cool. Thank you very much for that. And we've got questions flowing in now. I'm like,
Ooh.
Really? Brilliant. Could we have a little bit more information about allowing guests into your tenancy and then sharing or collaborating on files and things to watch out for potentially?
Okay, yeah. So guests, because they're not licensed users, guests will not have Copilot licenses. unless you actually choose to set them up a licensed account in your tenant. So you don't have to worry about somebody who's just been given access to a couple of files being able to then use your instance of Copilot on those files. That picture does change when you have external users that you have chosen to license in your tenant. Then you've got that choice. Do you give them Copilot or do you not give them Copilot? I would recommend that in 99.9% of cases, if they are genuinely external, you're not going to want to spend the money on a Copilot license for them anyway. If they are a contractor who is assigned to you to work for a period of time for a specific project, then it may be that Copilot will work for them. And it may be useful for them to have a license, but I would only do that if they're actually a contractor, kind of 100% assigned to you. When it comes to data access and Copilot, the biggest concern really is the internal data. Because like I say, guests aren't going to have a Copilot license, but it kind of works out that some of the broad brush measures that people might have done in the past to protect their data from unauthorized guest access is actually going to open up the data much more internally. So we really need to start having a look at those sharing settings, having a look at the defaults, having conversations with users to understand how they're using these settings, and looking at the auditing and reporting that we've got in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, just to have a little look at what's going on. And then we can take all of that data and take an actual kind of informed decision. But unlicensed users will not get Copilot. You choose who to give a Copilot license to. Internal data overshare is the biggest issue. And if someone is just in your tenant to do something for a month, you might not want to give them a license. But if they are a contractor that's working with you 100% for a slightly longer period of time, then you'll probably want to build something into your policies about when you do and when you don't give those people Copilot.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. I don't think we've got any more questions coming in at the moment. He says it's always when the hammer's just about to come down, you get another question.
It's going to be when I take a massive gulp of tea, isn't it?
I'll make sure it is. Yeah. Now, and yeah, I don't think we've got any other questions. But thank you very much, Jodie, for your time today, and for your wonderful explanations of Copilot and its accoutrement and what it can do for you as a business. Hopefully everyone is still awake and has been drinking coffee steadily throughout the entirety. And if there are any other questions about pricing, about anything else that needs to be addressed, if you'd get in touch with your account manager here at Example IT, it's available on the post that you might have clicked. You clicked on to register for this. Apologise to any of your colleagues if they were unable to get attendance to this event. Unfortunately, Microsoft sticks a limit on 1,000 users, 1,000 registrations for any webinar. But hey, it's good to have that sort of number attending today. So thank you very much, Jodie, and hopefully everyone had a good webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Jodie.